Well, let's start with an official hello to our listeners in North Bay. Love ya. Go troops, they all say. And by all, I mean the three people that reached out. And we said last week, there are two markets where we have not yet found a point of contact: North Bay and Barrie. So to John, listening from North Bay, who was the first to make a comment on our YouTube channel. Thank you. Brandon weighed in from the Sioux. We knew we had some love up north. We love you for that, and thanks. Sorry about the Greyhounds, but heck of a season, heck of a second round versus Saginaw. And maybe my favorite, no disrespect to John, was from one of the YouTube commenters who said he's listening all the way from Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, but he is a Troops fan. So North Bay came through in droves. To hell with you, Barrie, because apparently nobody wants to listen to the OHL podcast there. I kid, of course. Send an email anytime, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. Leave a comment on YouTube, a review on the podcast page. However you want to keep in touch with us. And thanks for following along. It's been another great season. But Dan Mahar, as we dive into this week's episode, boy, oh boy, the Oshawa Generals and London Knights are determined to make things boring, aren't they? 7 straight wins for the Oshawa Generals, 10 in a row for the London Knights, who are yet to taste defeat in these 2024 playoffs.
It's kind of crazy to think that you can go this long without a single loss. And both squads are proving yet again what we already know about playoff hockey. Anyone who's followed hockey in their lifetime knows that defense wins. And if you don't play structured defensive hockey and limit the opponent to probably 2 or less goals consistently, you're not going far in the playoffs. So I know juniors a little bit different from the NHL sometimes, that you can get away with a little bit more offensive flavor in your lineup and still win if you have a lot of potency. But boy, does defense ever win. And we're seeing it again and again with these two teams just cruising.
Yeah, and I might even take it a step further. They're obviously getting excellent goaltending, and these teams particularly are just built in such a way that you almost have come to expect this from them. Let me take it back a half a step further here in terms of some of the numbers, because they're pretty damn staggering. First and foremost, I saw Mike Stubbs, the radio play-by-play voice of the London Knights, share on Twitter the other day after London's 10th straight win that the Knights established a new franchise record for consecutive wins to start a playoff with that 10th win. They won 9 straight in 05 with that voted upon team of the century, and also a Memorial Cup team for London that year. But I don't know. And I haven't been able to determine this. And somewhere in the league offices, Herbie Morrell probably has the answer to it. But I'm not sure this isn't a league record for the London Knights. Now, maybe going back to when the series were 8 points, there might have been 10 consecutive wins to start a playoff. But the best I could find was the 05 Knights and then the 08 Rangers, who both started 9-0. So London now 10-0 is the best I can find, at least in what you might call the modern or the internet era for the league. One of the other things that's at stake here, as far as I can tell, and this is subject to correction from Herbie Morrell, who keeps all the stats either in his brain or in a notebook somewhere. We really have to pick that brain and get that notebook made electronic at some point. But nonetheless, 16-2, to the best of my knowledge, is the best mark we have seen through the playoffs. Now, Ottawa went through in 98 with just 2 losses, but they had a first round bye, so they only needed 12 wins that year. So a little bit different when they went 12-2. Ottawa went 12-2 again in 2001, but finished 16-4 in that playoff. And then the Knights in 05, when they started 9-0, finished 16-2 in the playoffs. And the Kitchener Rangers had a chance in 2008 to establish a new mark. When they started 9-0, they lost that second game of the third round to the Sioux, then won the next 3. So they were 12-1 after 3 rounds in 08 were the Rangers. They jumped out to a 3-0 series lead on Belleville that year, 15-1 with a chance to establish a new record for the fastest, I guess, through the playoffs in the Ontario Hockey League, all 4 rounds, until Belleville won the next 3 games and made it a 7-game OHL final. So Kitchener finishes 16-4 that way. That's just a long way around of saying that at 10-0, the 16-2 OHL playoff mark appears to be in the grasp of the London Knights this season too.
Which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it. You think back to some of those years you previously referenced, Mike, and typically you'd get a bit of a soft touch in the first round, maybe in those seasons, maybe even the second round with some weak conference years. This year we're in right now, we talked about at length. There were really no easy touches in that first round. I mean, you could argue maybe Flint was a bit of a softer touch for London, but really not a weak link on either side of the ledger. You saw the battle Barrie gave Oshawa in round one, and now you're looking at, I mean, Kitchener, North Bay, Sudbury. Like these are not easy teams to go through. The Ottawa 67s, who Oshawa had to knock off. You're looking at some heavy squads here. So, but the one kind of common denominator I can think of in some of those teams you referenced, Mike, are bigger physical teams, heavier teams that can maybe endure that grind a little better. I don't know if that's the recipe we're looking for, but I would say both London and Oshawa this year certainly fit that bill. And some of those teams you just referenced, they were usually the stronger physical team of the series they were playing in. So it might be a bit of a recipe there.
I know that you were speaking with one of our buddies down east who calls games in the queue and made it known that you are on Oshawa and London in these conference final series. I am in no way giving up the ghost on either North Bay or Saginaw, and not just because I started the playoffs that way, but I said from the beginning that it would be a Saginaw North Bay OHL final. So that's still a possibility, although I apologize to both teams because my prediction last year of Sarnia and North Bay obviously didn't work out when it was London and Peterborough. But I'm going to stick with them. And by no means are these teams remaining, despite being down 2-0 with game threes, by the way, being played as we record this tonight. But it's in no way over. And I'll maintain that even if the series go 3-0 tonight. Big hill to climb, no question about. But North Bay and Saginaw are formidable opponents. But, you know, you look at what Oshawa and London have done, not just in the playoffs, 10 straight wins for London, 7 in a row now for the Oshawa Generals. I took it back because you remember Oshawa finished the regular season with 12 straight wins, right? The London Knights finished the regular season with 7 straight wins. So added up, that's 17 games in a row for the London Knights. They haven't lost since March the 6th as we record this episode. And I thought I'm going to look back because if there's a criticism, and I think it's fair criticism in the Ontario Hockey League and likely the dub and the Q, although I don't follow it as closely. But once the trade deadline rolls around, you basically know who the contenders are and who the pretenders are. And you can virtually start penciling in your playoff bracket at that point, notwithstanding the final resting order of the teams, but you know who's geared up to make a run. And both Oshawa and London were certainly poised to do that. Since the trade deadline on January the 10th, the Oshawa Generals went from the trade deadline to the end of the season, regular season, in 32 games. They won 23 of them, lost only 4 in regulation, 4 OT losses, and 1 shootout loss. So 23, 4, 4, and 1 in their final 32 regular season games. You add in the playoff success to date at 10-2, and Oshawa becomes 33, 6, 4, and 1 over their past 44 games. I mean, 33 regulation wins out of 44 games, only 6 regulation losses. And then, of course, London says, excuse me, Oshawa, gives them a little pat on the helmet, hold my beer, because since the trade deadline on January the 10th, the London Knights have gone 23, 3 regulation losses, 1 in overtime, 2 in a shootout. That's the regular season mark in the final, 29 games, 23, 3, 1, and 2. Then you add in an unblemished playoff, and you've got 33 wins, just like the Oshawa Generals, but only 3 regulation losses with 1 overtime and 2 shootout losses. So 33 wins out of 39 games for the London Knights. incredible. Both of the teams that are leading these series right now have been incredible since the trade deadline.
And yeah, I would also add that arguably the toughest time either of them have had so far these playoffs were with those first round opponents. Flint pushing London to overtime a couple games, Barrie taking 2 from Oshawa. It almost feels like these teams know they're good. They have the structure they know they need to win. And the better their opponent, the more they ramp it up and the harder they are to play. And because both these teams have kind of really found their high against these toughest teams. And if you look at London, as good as they were down the stretch in the season and into the playoffs, I think even London fans would agree. If you look back at the odd blemish on their record, it wasn't against the top opponents. It was almost when they let their foot off the gas a bit against a team they were expected to beat. Maybe didn't quite have their heads screwed on straight for a game. They let up a little and lost. So it's like these teams have this edge where they draw from whom they're playing and just get better and better. And that's what championships or teams are kind of made of.
You look at some of the moves that were made throughout the season, particularly in Oshawa. I think the Connor Lockhart deal was a real savvy one for Roger Hunt. And then Connor Punnett at the deadline. I mean, just what a great piece to add. A big bruising defenseman who gets himself signed to a free agent NHL deal. And on the London side, ho hum, Caleb Lawrence is pretty nondescript, but the beauty of adding a guy like that is he's the kind of guy that's going to be in your lineup, save for the times he's out suspended for a questionable hit. But these are the big, heavy players with whom you make deep playoff runs and have incredible playoff success. Having watched the London Knights up close, they strike me as the kind of team that meets you in the schoolyard at lunch and says, I'm going to take your lunch money. And you can put up a fight if you want to, but eventually the third period rolls around. You're like, frig, just take my lunch money. Like I give up on it. Or if you brown bagged it for lunch that day, the London Knights will take your lunch from you and then eat it on their way off the ice while pointing at the scoreboard. I mean, it just doesn't seem to matter. They were trailing, remember, game one versus Saginaw into the third period, and then just thought, okay, I guess we're just going to keep grinding away and playing the big heavy game that we play and wearing you down to the point that we're going to win our ninth and now 10th straight games. But it's a big, heavy team. And Oshawa, I would argue, is very similar in that regard.
Very similar, and also structured, but don't lose their cool. They kind of have that, like you said, calmly say, "I'm going to take your lunch money," and then calmly go about the business of doing so. And when you look at in London, we talk about the team taking on the personality of the coach sometimes, and I'm not sure. Not all human beings are wired the same way. Some are wired on the 100th percentile of competitiveness. And I would say that's where Dale Hunter is. You look at his NHL career. If anyone hated to lose more than Dale Hunter, I'm not sure that was who that was. So he brings that, imparts that to his team. And now you look at kind of the way they're structured, and you referenced Caleb Lawrence going out of the lineup. They lost O'Reilly with a suspension for a while. Doesn't seem to matter. They can play any way you want to play them. If you want to push them physically, obviously they're going to answer that. You want to up the tempo a little, they're going to score goals on you. You want to shut it down and make it a 2-1 game, they can do that. So there's you talked about wearing a team down over a series, Mike, and it sure looks like that's what they do, because they grind you. They grind you any way you want to grind them. Anytime you try and push back, they've got an answer. And over 4, 5, 6, 7 games, just suck the fight out of their opponent, right?
Not having Zane Parekh is obviously a huge factor for the Saginaw Spirit. Not having Anthony Romani, and I know this isn't new for North Bay, but still, the deeper you go, the stiffer the competition, the more these absences are magnified. So those are not to make excuses, but those are realities that both the North Bay Battalion and Saginaw Spirit are facing as they get the chance to come back onto home ice. Again, as we record, game threes are happening in North Bay, in Saginaw. And as we've said a number of times through these playoffs already, Dan, it's a well-worn phrase for a reason. It's not a series until the home team loses. That has not yet happened, although by the time this is released, it might have. But North Bay and Saginaw, what are they going to have to do to turn things back in their favor in these series?
It's hard to say because these games have been so low scoring and so close. It's obvious that they're not out of it. It's obvious that they're still putting up a fight, and 2-0 at time of this recording is hardly a end of series type scenario. Having said that, when I watched North Bay, Oshawa in game 2, what struck me is I thought North Bay was doing a lot of the things they would need to do to succeed against Oshawa. They were physical early, brought some energy, brought some jump. They had structure. They limited chances against. It looked like just over the course of the game and trying to maintain that focus and trying to maintain that structure, forgot to really push the puck up ice in the way they did in some of the games in the season where they remembered, we have some offensive potency. And I saw some of these guys trying to do it. I saw Justin Ertl making some dashes into the zone and kicking it back to the point. I saw some of these things happening that happened in previous series, but they run into that wall 3 or 4 across on Oshawa, and then there's no steam in that rush anymore. So there's very little traffic getting in front of Oster and net. Pucks are cleared quickly. You're not getting the second and third chances. So to answer your question, I think North Bay's got to find a way to stop in front of that net, maintain their ground there, get some tips, get some rebounds, play a little bit nasty like you can, and have that answer. And on Saginaw's side, lacking Zane Prek is a huge problem for them because so much of their rush offense comes from him. But don't forget, they've got Jurian Donovan there as well. They've got some other puck movers, and I think you look at a few guys that are just going to need to elevate. Namely, you look at a guy like Owen Beck, has not had a point in a few games here. That they paid a big price to get him. He's a guy that is going to play the 200-foot game, going to do okay in draws, but he's going to have to post some points too. So I look at some of those big names on that roster that just need to, they're going to have to step up to fill the void by Perek, because that team is loaded for bear, but you can't score 1 goal in 2 consecutive games with that roster. Got to get to the net. It's the age old, got to get to the net and stay there. Stop on the net, not one and done.
Liam Arnsby back from serving his 6-game suspension for North Bay tonight. Maybe that gives them a boost. Their 3rd consecutive appearance in the East Final. The reason that I picked them at the beginning of these playoffs is not only did I like the way they were playing, even in the absence, and it turns out in the playoffs, without DiVincentis, without Anthony Romani, but I just thought some unfinished business. And that got me thinking about North Bay and that 3rd consecutive appearance in the conference final. I thought that's a pretty good run. We talked about this last week. Twice when they first moved to North Bay after leaving Brampton and going north and reestablishing an OHL team in North Bay, they have their first 2 years up there back-to-back conference finals appearances, and then 3 straight now. So 5 basically over the past decade. I thought that's a pretty tidy little run. So I took a look at the past 25 years in the league, Dan, and it comes out kind of interesting. I asked you just randomly who you thought in the last 25 years had won the most OHL, or who had won the most OHL championships, had made it to the most Memorial Cups, or the most conference championships, pardon me. And you guessed Windsor, which surprised me. We were just overthinking it, right? Because I think nobody is surprised that the London Knights lead the way in Final Four appearances over the past 25 years, right? They've been here 11 times in the past 25 years. So basically pencil them in every other year, and the London Knights are going to be there in the Final Four. But I was a little bit surprised. Every single team has made a conference finals appearance in the past 25 years. So you've got Sudbury, Sarnia, Kingston, and Saginaw with just 1. But every other team in the league has 2 or more appearances in the Final Four. Then when you get on to being a conference champion, again, it's London leading the way with those 11 appearances. They've won the Western Conference 7 times in the past 25 years. And that's where things start to break down for some of the teams again. You've got 3 teams that have never won their conference. One of them is Kingston, another one is Sarnia, and the third, once again, is the Saginaw Spirit. So they're battling history, would like to establish something for that franchise. And then when you get into actually winning the OHL and becoming that entry into the Memorial Cup for the Ontario Hockey League, only, and I think it's fair to say only, 12 teams. I know I'm getting ahead of myself, and we'll get to talk more about this as we get into the conference finals and the OHL championship, or into the OHL championship, but only 12 of the 20 teams have won. So just over half have won an OHL championship in the past 25 years in the league. So 8 teams, a big fat donut when it comes to Memorial Cup appearances. And you would think again, well, London's going to lead the way, right? The Guelph Storm, right there, tied with London in the past quarter century for OHL championships in 25 years, which is a hell of a ratio for the Guelph Storm.
It really is. And, when you first asked that question, I think the brain instantly translates it into who else other than London, obviously. So you start thinking of these other teams. And yeah, Windsor popped to mind, but I had to admit how quickly the memory fades. As soon as you mention Guelph, you start to remember all those great teams they had. And it's just, you go a few years with hard luck and you forget that team as a legit contender, a consistent contender. But yeah, that was a pretty impressive run by the Guelph Storm in those years.
And Windsor with 3 Memorial Cups in 9 years. One of them, though, they didn't win the OHL championship. They got bounced in the first round and then came back and won as hosts in 2017. So one of the other teams that really stood out to me was Brantford / Hamilton / Belleville. So 3 OHL championships, 2 as the Hamilton Bulldogs, 1 as the Belleville Bulls. I counted them all under the same franchise, and that gets into a whole other story. For how long do you maintain these records? But nonetheless, I thought it was kind of interesting to see how every team. So whatever team you are a fan of, you've had the opportunity in the past 25 years to get to the Final Four, where Oshawa, North Bay, Saginaw, and London are right now, which I think is a pretty decent achievement, putting yourself in the top 20% of the league on any given year. It starts to break down the further you go. And when you see, London has 11 appearances and Saginaw has 1, you'd like to see a little more of that success, but we all know that London has established the model that other teams would like to emulate. So here we are.
Yeah, it's another surprise, right? When you hear those team names, and I know there's been some hard luck and droughts in Sarnia, and you think, those fans deserve a title team. One of these, they've had a few years where they should have been, quite frankly, including last year, perhaps. But they've had some brilliant teams where you thought that Saginaw is the beast in the West, and they just didn't get it done. But Saginaw is one of those funny teams where they've had some really good skating teams right over the years, and always in that top 4 or 5 in the conference. You think of them as a consistently good team, just can't get over the hump in the playoffs. So obviously trying to expunge some demons this year, and are going to have to find the way back to do it.
Well, and in order to do that too, you just think of the way this Western Conference established itself this year, not to take anything away from the Kitchener Rangers per se, but really Sioux gave Saginaw everything it could handle in the second round. London is giving Saginaw everything it can handle in this round. And you still have another round to go before the Memorial Cup. I like it when the team gets in through the front door. That's what the Spirit want to do. It's going to be all hands on deck in order to make that happen for Saginaw. But just think of what they've gone through to get to that point, given where they are right now. It's a heck of a war. And if they end up losing to a team like the London Knights in these conference finals, I mean, do you really hang your head about that? No, but it's also then likelier that you're going to have to go through that same London team when the Memorial Cup rolls around in about a month's time.
For sure. And it's hard for them to look at the team they've assembled, right? Like, you look at the team Dave Drinkill put together on paper, the job Chris Lazary's done. You think you have all the components there. Then you run into an absolute brick wall like London, who's just been dismantling teams, and you have to start. This is team after team that hasn't figured them out, hasn't figured out the recipe to beat London. And it's easy to say, well, London has access to extra players, or make any excuse you want to make. But let's not forget, London was not running this way in the first half of the year. They looked like there was a couple teams in the West better than them. So they've improved without making dramatic trades like you suggested. Just Caleb Lawrence and these other teams loaded up and have actually been passed by the team that didn't load up. So there's a formula there and a recipe there that these coaches need to find and these opponents need to find. And so far, no one has found it.
If you like the underdogs, both the Battalion in their entire franchise history, I might add, going back to Brampton, and Saginaw, the former North Bay, but we won't even get into all of that. But both Saginaw and North Bay are 2 of the 8 teams that have never won an OHL championship. So they're in tough in this round. Then they might have to play each other, and only one can advance from there. But if you're looking for the underdog story, I suppose as much as a Memorial Cup host can be an underdog story, those would be your underdog stories remaining in these playoffs. All right. We'll keep moving along here. Chad Wiseman becomes number 6. We've got mail in our OHL podcast inbox, and Dan finds one of the more obscure names. I had to look them up, but okay. Another nod to a former OHL'er into the Stanley Cup playoffs. And of course, our prospects of the week still to come on this episode of the OHL podcast. I don't know if it's the kind of club that you really want to join, Dan, but first it was Ted Dent, then it was Greg Walters, then it was Luca Caputi, Ryan Kuwabara, Jared Smith, and I think I'm going to lump Chad Wiseman into this season, even though the season is over for the Guelph Storm. But earlier today, Chad Wiseman was relieved of his duties as head coach in Guelph.
It's a tough one for me, Mike, because I get it. It was a team that probably was expected to be better on paper this year. Never really found it. But why it's a tough one for me is we saw the injury problems that they dealt with, some of the lineup juggling that Chad Wiseman had to do. They lost, well, not that they lost, but they never really got Matthew Poitras to start the year, who was a big piece. Didn't play with Cam Allen, who was supposed to be the number 1 defenseman. Played extended periods without Michael Bushinger. And you can go, and I know these all sound like excuses, but when you have your key players missing for extended periods, every time one goes down, you're trying to realign, regain that chemistry, figure out the process with the new lineup. So and there were times where I thought Chad Wiseman did that well. I thought the team came out hard and played well. They never seemed to find that balance where they could score enough goals and keep enough out of their net. It seemed to be, okay, we found the recipe to get 4 or 5 goals this game, but we surrendered 6. Okay, we held them to 2, but now we only scored 1. So they never really could find that balance, and I guess Chad Wiseman pays the price. But all I will say is I've definitely seen worse coach teams than the Chad Wiseman team this year. So it feels like, sometimes the coach pays the price for some circumstances.
I think that's really well said, and I can't disagree. I think it was just a few weeks ago on this podcast that I was kind of singing Chad Wiseman's praises for some of the very reasons that you mentioned. And look, we can sit back and make a litany of excuses. You've already touched on the injury woes, the not getting Poitras back. How good was the goaltending? It was good in spurts, but show me a good goaltender, I'll show you a good coach. That's an old saying for a reason too. Nonetheless, it is. I used the description earlier today. If you're talking about it in poker language, you'd call it a bad beat, right? Chad Wiseman. It's one of those things where I do suppose the team, given its veteran nature, was expected to do more. It was unable to meet or exceed those expectations. And so somebody's got to take the fall. And when you're a head coach in sports, you know that even at this level, you are the person that does take the fall. So over 2 seasons, Chad Wiseman leaves with a winning record at 68, 56, 10, and 2 as a head coach. And dare I say, I don't know about not being out of work for long, but I don't think that Chad Wiseman will be gone from this league forever. I'll put it that way. I would strongly suspect that he finds his way back behind a bench at some point, if not as a head coach, certainly as an assistant. But I think he's proven himself just fine for the role as head coach in this league as well, considering what he did with Guelph this year.
Definitely. And don't forget the circumstances under which he had to take over that role as well, right? Where he wasn't expected to step into that role right away with some health issues with Scott Walker, and you end up with the job at your hands, and you didn't necessarily have all the prep time that you expected. You didn't necessarily have the time to assemble your staff. So again, a lot of things were working against Chad Wiseman, and I thought he did quite an admirable job, and I'm sure people were noticing. So like you said, Mike, he's going to find a job again before too long, because enough people noticed the job he did there.
You think Burnett's got it in him? Do you think he wants to be back behind that bench? I say that halfways, maybe even 3/4 in jest. I don't think that's the plan for either George Burnett or the Guelph Storm, but it is interesting. I mean, George has been around this league for a very long time. He's been in the same position that he's put Chad Wiseman in. It's the job of the general manager to execute those decisions wherever they come from amongst the ownership group, et cetera. And you wonder at this point, like, it's a really interesting place. And I think we touched on this recently too on this podcast, where the Guelph Storm are kind of at now heading into next year, considering how many 19-year-olds they had on the roster this year. You don't get to keep them all. And that'll be the subject we get to when we get to our email inbox in just a bit. But the Guelph Storm are, I think it's fair to say, about to start some sort of rebuild or reset here in the Midwest division. So, what does that look like from a coach's perspective? Do you want to maybe do something along the lines the Kitchener Rangers just did and bring in somebody completely fresh and brand new to build the next group up the chain here with the Guelph Storm?
Maybe, and maybe that's the case. Maybe there's someone they have in mind. Maybe that's what happened. The I know you were tongue in cheek, but the role of coach GM, it seems harder and harder to perform both those duties in this league anymore. Both jobs have gotten so big in the day of analytics and hefty scouting of various sources, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very hard job to do both roles. So unless it's for budgetary reasons, I would imagine they'd like to still keep the split. And George Burnett stay in the role he's in. So we'll see where they go for that hire. But you may be right. Maybe there's an option they have in mind that is out of left field. So I guess time will tell.
We should give a nod to, or Dan wants to give a nod to somebody that I'd completely forgotten about in this league from 5 years ago, Arturs Silovs.
Yeah.
Thank you. Makes his NHL debut in the playoffs, no less. Former Barrie Colt. Good eye by you, Dansky.
Well, I had to shout it out, right? Because you've got a guy here who was kind of a forgotten man out in Vancouver, third stringer coming into the playoffs behind Thatcher Demko and Casey DeSmith. Of course, the injury to Demko, pedestrian effort from DeSmith, and suddenly Silovs is in the net. And shouldn't say author, probably the forwards authored the comeback and the impressive comeback win in overtime against Nashville. But here you got the net now for Silovs, and is he going to stay there? So Barrie Colts grad of 2019-20. So just interesting to see the OHL grads show up this time of year in the NHL.
Love to see it. I believe overall there are more than 100 OHL grads competing in these NHL playoffs. If you wondered if it's still the best development league in the world, it probably is. Silovs had 36 games with Barrie in that COVID shortened season back in 2019-2020. So good on him, and a nod indeed. Speaking of nods to players that had come through this league, and one I think will be back, but isn't it interesting in the American League, Coachella Valley, where with the farm team or the AHL team of the Seattle Kraken, where Carson Rakoff has been assigned, is taking on the Calgary Wranglers in the AHL playoffs. And of course, Rakoff's buddy and teammate from Kitchener, Hunter Brustevich, is with the AHL's Calgary Wranglers. So they could go from playing with each other all season long and in the OHL playoffs to playing against each other in the American Hockey League playoffs. How do you like that?
Well, a life in hockey throws some interesting twists at you, right? It's 1 week you're in a playoff battle as teammates, the next week you're facing each other in another playoff battle, and it's got to be hard to kind of tune up again with a brand new team, new teammates, and whatnot. But I think both those players are probably going to do a lot more watching right now than playing as the season peters out, and then next year will be their shot.
All right. I want to go to the inbox, OHL podcast at Rogers.com. Send us a note anytime. I think what Val is getting at with this email, Dan, is maybe some homework for you and me as we move into the OHL finals and then to the Memorial Cup. This might not be a bad topic to kind of take a look at league wide, but here's what Val has to say. Mike and Dan, I find your podcasts informative for all of the OHL. Thank you for that. We get accused a lot of being Western Conference biased. We probably are, but we try to spread the love around. Not only about the players, but also behind the scenes, says Val in the email. As a longtime Ranger fan, I think that's where most of our fans are. Have I mentioned yet that Barrie has not even acknowledged that the entire city has not acknowledged that they listen to this podcast? Anyway, Val is a longtime Ranger fan and thinks a lot of people would like to know which players who are going to be overagers are not returning. Also, your opinions, who also may be moving on and who might be the overage players next year from the current Ranger roster. Keep up the great podcasts. Val, thank you very much for the email. Again, send yours anytime, OHL podcast at Rogers.com. At the risk of being too Rangers centric, although I do believe that's where Probably because that's where we're based, Dan. And Rangers fans are the best fans, right? I just said that to tick off 19 other fan bases. We probably have a larger number of fans in Kitchener, but I think Val's onto something maybe to take a look around the league at who we might think will be the impact overagers into next season. So I think I'm just speaking out loud and giving us the homework. Maybe we'll look at doing that before we call it a summer. We'll keep this podcast going again until the NHL draft, and we'll talk about the players from the O that get drafted. Then we'll all take a little bit of a summer break. But before that, I don't think it could hurt at all to kind of take a look at the players we believe will be impact overagers next year in the OHL. So specific to Val's question about the Kitchener Rangers, the way I see it, Dan, and you can probably correct me if I've missed one, but both goaltenders, Parsons and Malbuff, would be overagers next year. The aforementioned Hunter Brustevich would be an overager. Philip Machar. I don't think either of those guys will be back with the Kitchener Rangers next year. And then you've got three more forwards in Adrian Miseljevic, Antonino Pugliese, and Trent Swick. So with those three plus the two goaltenders, you only can keep three overagers. The Rangers do have some decisions to make, unless I've missed somebody here, Dan.
No, you nailed it. And obviously that's a great example that would apply across the league, really, when it's we'll do that homework for you and try and figure out what our thoughts are. But really that question is best answered in the fall because a lot of wild cards come into play. And you look at the names you just listed, Mike, on the Kitchener example, teams are not going to keep two overage goalies. So one of Parsons and Malbuff gone for sure. And then you look at Brustevich and Machar gone onto the pro ranks almost certainly as well. So you've probably got four candidates for three OA positions in Pugliese, Miseljevic, Swick, and one of the goalies, probably Jackson Parsons. So you look at those three forwards and you might start to think, well, who's going to be there? Quite possibly all three. But then you look at a big body like Trent Swick, who had an extremely good year up and down the ice, 200-foot game, put up some points, a point a game player. Might a 6'7" player like him at 20 years old latch on with a pro contract? Might he play part of a season up? So all those questions come into play for every single OHL team. Like, so it's a question that we can certainly speculate on now and give you some idea of what you might see in your lineups, but those questions never really clarify. I was going to say to the start of next season, but sometimes not even till December once these guys return to lineups.
You make a really good point on that. And yeah, anything that we do in the next month or so on this podcast leading up to the NHL draft would be just that, speculation, for the reasons that you just outlined, Dan. Bottom line for you OHL fans, if you didn't know how it all works out, you're allowed to keep three of the overagers. So you can turn 21 in that particular season. But this year coming up, it will be the 04s. If the player is born in 2004, so beginning the season as a 20-year-old in September, those will be the players that would be considered overagers. You're only allowed to have three on the roster. And, you would make decisions for your own team for a variety of reasons, right? Like, I completely agree. And I don't think there's any team that would keep two overage spots for goaltenders. But maybe the Kitchener Rangers look at their prospects next year and say, we don't want any overagers as goaltenders. Who knows? So there will be that level of speculation attached to it as well. But we'll take a look more closely at it. Maybe we can even give an early projection as to who's going to be that Leo Lalonde winner of the Overager of the Year next year. Why not call it in May of 24? Who's going to be winning it in April of 25?
Definitely. And yeah, that's one thing we can do now for sure too, is take a look across the league at all the graduating overagers. The ones who definitely will not be back. Like in Kitchener's case, you're looking at Matthew Sopp, Simon Motu, and Mitchell Martin definitely sailing on. And there will be three players for every one of those OHL teams who have seen their last game in the OHL. So we can give a little bit of a nod there as well.
All right. I think the remaining piece of business is our performer of the week. Did I call them prospect of the week before? I might have done that. Either way,
yeah,
we switch it up all year long. Dan and I like to look at the draft eligible player that we noticed the most in that past week. Once we get into playoff time, we look at it as just a performer of the week, the player that stood out to us. So who do you have this week, Dansky?
Well, I struggled with this one, Mike, because I had, again, 3 or 4 names. The one I landed on, though, was I want to go a little off the board and not just go by some offensive stats. I want to go with someone who's a backbone player, doesn't light up the score sheet, but has been absolutely critical to his team's success. And that's Isaiah George on the back end in London. easily in my mind, one of the most underrated players in this league. Rarely out of position, rarely deviates from his standard of game after game. If you watch, I think it was the funny thing is during the Kitchener London series, there was one particular Kitchener goal where he lost his gap a little, and that stood out to me like a sore thumb because you so rarely see him lose his gap, and you think, wow, this is the standard we hold this player to now, where he's almost always in position, good stick in the lane, quick to find the puck in his feet, calm zone exits. It just does everything so well in a professional manner, and I expect to see Isaiah George move on to pro level at some point before too long, just because of that high IQ calm game he plays, and won't light up the score sheet, but sure is a key piece on that back end that plays pretty mistake free. So Isaiah George is my guy. Mike, who you got?
One of the plays that I saw Isaiah George make in these playoffs, completely away from him providing the kind of defensive coverage that you just described. We all know how nasty that London Kitchener series got. And there was one particular shift changer. It was near the bench. Regardless, anyway, he took a wicked. And I don't remember, honest to goodness, as God is my witness, I don't remember who gave it to him, but he took a wicked slash across the back of the leg. And you could tell how much it hurt. And he kind of took a glance and then realized, no, I think he was just getting off the bench. Either way, he had a job to do. So he kind of shook it off and went down the ice to do his job where he was needed in that moment. And I like that stuff. I just, that's the way the game gets played. It gets played like that even more in the playoffs. You're going to dish it out from time to time. You're going to take some, but he was very task oriented, shall I say, in that moment. It impressed me. My guy, listen, I'm trying to stay away from being so dazzled by the goaltenders. So I'm sticking to that after giving them back-to-back nods, but I'm still dazzled by the offense. And it's a guy that hadn't been producing a ton until this series with North Bay. And now you've got Stuart Roloffs in 2 games. He's got 3 goals. There's one of those big bodies. There's some contributions you're getting from a guy that you only had 1 goal from in the previous playoff games for Oshawa. So I looked at Stuart Roloffs and said, gosh, and I think I said this last week, when it matters the most, and so far these games matter the most to all of these teams, and you're coming up in a big way, I like that from you. So Stuart Roloffs is my performer of the week.
Then it might not surprise you, Mike, if I were to tell you Stuart Roloffs was actually my runner-up. And I saw those 3 goals in those first 2 games, and just you like to see a player who a first-round pick had a bit of a slow start in the league, was traded by the Hunter brothers from London to Oshawa. There's a guy that's gonna make an interesting storyline should those teams meet next round. But really found his footing later in his career in the OHL, and here he is wearing the C for Oshawa and coming through at the right times. And a consistent thread we're seeing, Mike, is these older players delivering for their teams, veteran, experienced players that have figured out how to play at these times of year, and that's who's stepping up right now.
That London connection is not lost on me. And I felt like I went a little bit deep in looking at the past 25 years of appearances in the conference finals, OHL finals, winning OHL championships. And I don't mean to, bog down the daily details with some of the stuff that we'll get into down the road, but there are a number of really intriguing subplots left here, right? Like Stuart Roloff's a former Knight, potentially facing his former team. We talked about those 3 regulation losses for both the London Knights and the Oshawa. Sorry, 4 for Oshawa, 3 for London in the last half, basically, of the regular season. Each lost to one another in regulation, both London and Oshawa. So there's that aspect. You could have North Bay and Saginaw, the team that once left North Bay as the Centennials, playing the new team that's been reestablished there. All kinds of great storylines. I think I mentioned already Adam Dennis, the general manager in North Bay, of course, won a Memorial Cup with London back in 2005. The 4 remaining teams offer us just incredible richness in storylines for sure.
Definitely. And don't forget that if London should go on to beat Saginaw, then Oshawa or North Bay, whoever wins that series, is going to have to win that series to get to the Memorial Cup. So there's going to be no free secondary pass because Saginaw is the host. So a little more intrigue to follow the rest of this week anyway.
Absolutely. We appreciate you, as always, following the OHL podcast. Follow Dan and I on Twitter as well. Dan's at his name, at Dan Mahar. I'm at Farwell_. OHL. Leave a comment on the YouTube channel, leave a review on the podcast page. Tell a friend, please do, and send an email anytime. OHL podcast at Rogers.com. We'll be back in your ears 1 week from today.